Kwame, Kwames, look at this house. Rent overdue, school fees unpaid.
Kwame, one more week. After that, you are out.
Dad, teacher said...
Tomorrow is the final payment day.
Tell me the truth, Kwame. What are you hiding?
I'm handling it.
Mr. Mensah, regarding your employment termination.
In a crowded African neighborhood, far from luxury, far from comfort, stood a small aging family house, not broken enough to collapse, but tired enough to show years of struggle. Inside that modest home lived 4 people, a father, a mother, a daughter, and a little boy who still believed life was simpler than it really was. Their home was small. The walls were cracked in places, the furniture was old, money was always short, but every morning, they still woke up and tried again. The father's name was Kwame Mensah, 38 years old, a husband, a father of 2, and a man carrying more pressure than anyone around him fully understood. Every morning, Kwame tried to look strong, because in his mind, fathers were not supposed to look afraid. He had once worked a stable office job, nothing glamorous, nothing rich, just enough to keep food on the table, school uniforms washed, and monthly bills barely under control. Kwame was quiet by nature, hardworking, responsible, the type of man who checked prices twice before buying anything for himself. If money was short, he would skip his own needs first, but lately, the tiredness inside his eyes had started lasting longer than his sleep. His name was Abena Mensah, 35 years old, patient, practical, quietly strong, the kind of woman who could stretch a small amount of food, a small amount of money, and somehow make both survive one more week. Most of her days were spent inside the rhythm of ordinary survival, cooking, cleaning, managing expenses, watching every coin carefully, trying to protect her children from worries children should never have to carry. Abena rarely complained, but pressure has a way of hiding itself. Inside forced smiles, inside long silences, inside mothers who say they're fine. Their daughter's name was Ama Mensah, 10 years old, curious, observant, and far more emotionally aware than most adults realized. Ama loved school. She loved notebooks, stories, and imagining bigger futures than the neighborhood around her could offer. But children notice more than parents think, and lately, Ama had started noticing things. Longer silences between her parents, smaller food portions, the tiredness in her father's smile. She didn't fully understand the problem yet, but she could feel it living quietly inside the house. The youngest member of the family was Kojo Mensah, 7 years old, energetic, talkative, and still young enough to believe that his father could fix almost anything in the world. Kojo loved small things, bottle caps turned into toys, cardboard boxes turned into cars, old broken pencils turned into treasure. He asked endless questions, he laughed loudly, he dreamed easily, and every evening, the happiest part of his day was hearing the front door open and believing Dad is finally home. Kojo did not understand rent or unpaid bills or hidden financial pressure. To him, his father wasn't a struggling man carrying invisible burdens. He was simply Dad. This was the Mensah family, 4 people, 1 small house, too many responsibilities and never enough money. Their days looked ordinary from the outside. Morning breakfasts, school routines, work clothes, homework, dinner conversations. But inside those familiar routines lived quiet pressure, bills waiting unpaid, school expenses waiting quietly inside notebooks, food portions measured carefully, dreams postponed 1 month at a time. Still, they kept moving forward because sometimes families don't continue because life becomes easier. They continue because stopping is simply not an option. If you had looked at this family from the outside, you might not have noticed anything unusual. No dramatic arguments, no obvious disaster, just a normal family trying to survive another month. But sometimes, the biggest struggles inside a home are the ones hidden behind routine. And inside this house, a truth was already growing quietly, a truth that would slowly change everything. The morning light slowly entered the room, soft, warm, and silent, as if even the sun knew. This house carried too much quiet struggle. Kwame Mensah sat silently on the edge of his bed, as if the weight of every past decision was sitting right beside him. He slowly buttoned his faded shirt, one button at a time, not because he was ready, but because the world did not allow him to stop. In the quiet kitchen, Abina Mensah moved silently, preparing food that was never enough, but always made with care. Amma slowly opened her eyes, and for a moment, she just lay still, listening to the silence of another ordinary morning. Kojo stretched his small arms and yawned deeply, still lost between sleep and the reality waiting outside. Kwame reached for his old bag, not because it carried anything, but because it helped him pretend that everything was still normal. Amma watched him quietly, not asking anything, but understanding far more than her age should allow. At the door, Kwame paused, as if something inside him was trying to speak, but failed to find words. The old wooden door slowly closed behind Kwame Mensah, and the sound echoed softly through the small house, like the beginning of another long day built on silence. Amma quickly climbed off the mattress and quietly moved toward the window just to watch her father, while his face carried the pressure of a truth nobody at home knew. From the small window, Amma watched him disappear further down the road, and like every morning, she believed her father was going to work to take care of the family. Halfway down the street, Kwame slowed his steps for a moment, then quietly turned his head back toward the house, as if leaving his family behind had become harder every single day. After a few silent seconds, Kwame turned his face away from the house again, tightened his grip on the office bag, and forced himself to keep walking forward. As Kwame moved further away from home, the streets slowly became louder, people rushing to work, motorcycles passing by, small shops opening for the day. Real office workers passed beside him, talking about meetings, salaries, and deadlines, while Kwame remained silent, pretending he belonged among them. The fake smile he wore for his children slowly disappeared from his face, and the deeper he walked into the city, the harder it became to pretend. Finally, Kwame reached a small park near the edge of the city, the same place he came to every morning after pretending to leave for work. Kwame slowly sat down on the old wooden bench, placing the office bag beside him, as if the act of pretending had finally become too heavy to carry on his shoulder. People continued walking past the park, hurrying toward real jobs, real offices, real responsibilities, while Kwame could only sit there and watch. After a long silence, Kwame slowly pulled the tie away from his neck, finally allowing himself to breathe like a man no longer pretending. Kwame reached into his pocket, pulled out his old wallet, and quietly stared at the little money left inside. Suddenly, his phone vibrated inside his pocket, and for a brief second, fear immediately appeared in his eyes. Kwame slowly pulled the phone from his pocket, and the moment he saw the caller's name, the little piece left on his face quietly disappeared. It was the landlord again, calling for the third time that week, asking for rent Kwame no longer knew how to pay. For a few seconds, Kwame only stared at the phone ringing in his hand, as if answering it would make his problems feel even more real. Then, after taking a slow breath, Kwame answered the call, already knowing the conversation would hurt. As the landlord spoke from the other side of the phone, Kwame's face slowly tightened, and the shame he tried to hide every day became impossible to control. The landlord's voice grew harder over the phone, reminding Kwame that the rent was already 2 months late and warning him that patience was running out. Kwame slowly closed his eyes for a moment, trying to remain calm, even while every word on the phone felt heavier than the last. "I just need a little more time," Kwame said softly into the phone, his voice calm, but carrying the exhaustion of a man slowly losing control of his life. A few painful seconds later, the call ended, leaving behind a silence that somehow felt even worse. Kwame unlocked his phone again, but this time, he wasn't looking at missed calls or messages. He was looking at the family photo saved on his screen. Kwame's hand trembled slightly as he stared at the family photo because the smiles on the screen reminded him of the lie he repeated every single morning. Ama and Kojo were laughing in the picture, completely unaware that their father no longer had a real office to go to. Unable to look any longer, Kwame slowly lowered the phone into his lap and stared silently at the empty ground ahead of him. Suddenly, another notification appeared on his phone, this time from Ama's school. The message was short, cold, and impossible to ignore. Ama's school fees were overdue again, and the final payment deadline was only days away. Kwame slowly lowered his head, as if the message had drained the little strength he still had left inside him. Back at home, life continued quietly, completely unaware of the storm slowly growing inside Kwame's heart. "Mama, do you think Papa works too hard?" Ama asked softly, without looking away from her notebook. For a brief second, Abena stopped washing the dishes because even she no longer knew how to answer questions about the man she loved. And somewhere far from home, Kwame Mensah still sat alone in the park, wearing office clothes for a job he no longer had, while the people he loved most continued believing everything was still okay. As the morning moved forward, the park slowly became quieter, and the people rushing to work disappeared one by one, leaving Kwame alone with his thoughts again. Kwame looked down at his watch, pretending to follow a normal office schedule, even though he had nowhere to be. He had left home without eating breakfast again, making sure the children had enough first, even if it meant setting hungry for the rest of the day. From across the street, the smell of hot food drifted through the air, reminding Kwame how long it had been since he spent money on himself. Still, He opened his wallet one more time, hoping somehow the amount inside would look different than before. One small note, a few coins, and nothing more. Kwame counted them slowly anyway, as if delaying reality for a few extra seconds. A small boy carrying bottled water walked through the park, calling out softly to strangers, trying to make a few coins before noon. Kwame quietly watched the child walking from person to person, and for a painful moment, he saw himself in the boy's tired eyes. Kwame lowered his eyes almost immediately because some truths become harder to face when they appear in someone else's life too. By midday, the sunlight had become harsher, and the heat slowly settled over the city like a heavy blanket. Kwame remained on the same bench, still pretending he had somewhere important to be. After sitting in the heat for too long, Kwame quietly stood up, picked up his office bag, and moved toward the shade beneath a large tree. At home, Abina carefully prepared lunch using the little food left in the kitchen, stretching every ingredient as far as possible, the way mothers often do when money becomes tight. "Mama, is there a little more?" Kojo asked innocently, holding his nearly empty plate with both small hands. For a brief second, Abina's face tightened with worry, but before the children could notice, she forced a gentle smile back onto her face. Without saying anything, Abina quietly placed part of her own food onto Kojo's plate, pretending she was no longer hungry herself. Amma stayed quiet during lunch, but her eyes noticed everything: the smaller food portions, the tired silence, and the worry her mother tried so hard to hide. Far from home, Kwame entered a small public library he often visited during the day, not to read, but simply to sit somewhere cool without being asked questions. Kwame chose the same corner seat he always used, far enough from people, close enough to disappear quietly into the background. An old newspaper rested open in front of him, but Kwame wasn't reading the words anymore. His mind was somewhere else entirely, and while the city continued moving around him, Kwame Mensah remained trapped between two lives: the father his family believed in, and the broken man silently hiding behind office clothes every single day. Inside the quiet library, time seemed to move slower for Kwame Mensah than it did for everyone else. Every passing minute only reminded him that he still had hours left before he could pretend to return home from work. Students typed on computers, workers read newspapers, pages turned softly across the room, and in the middle of all of it, Kwame sat completely lost inside his own thoughts. A soft hunger pain twisted inside his stomach again, but Kwame ignored it the same way he ignored most of his suffering these days. Instead of buying food, Kwame slowly drank water from the public fountain nearby, trying to fool his empty stomach for a little longer. Back at home, Amma carefully cleaned her old-school shoes near the doorway, trying her best to make them look newer than they really were. As Amma cleaned the shoes, she quietly noticed the sole beginning to separate underneath, but instead of complaining, she simply pressed it back together with her fingers. From the kitchen doorway, Abaina silently watched her daughter trying to fix the shoes herself, and for a moment, the guilt in her heart became almost unbearable. Far away in the library, Kwame quietly searched for jobs again, scrolling through endless listings that either required experience, connections, or qualifications he didn't have. One by one, the opportunities disappeared in front of him. Position filled, experience required, application closed, and slowly, hope became harder to hold on to. As the afternoon slowly continued, Kwame Mensah remained trapped inside a life built entirely on survival, pretending to go to work, pretending to stay strong, pretending everything would somehow be okay, even while the truth quietly collapsed around him. Slowly, the bright afternoon sunlight outside the library windows began to soften, and Kwame knew the hardest part of the day was getting closer. Soon, he would have to return home and pretend all over again. Kwame looked at his watch once more, carefully calculating the exact time a working father was supposed to return home. Before leaving the library, Kwame quietly adjusted his clothes in the reflection of a dark window, trying to make himself look less broken before going home. At home, the lights suddenly shut off without warning, and the small house fell into silence for a brief moment. "Mama, did we forget to pay again?" Kojo asked quietly from the corner of the room. "No. It's probably just the neighborhood power line," Abena replied gently, even though deep inside, she already feared the real reason. Amma didn't say anything this time, but the silence on her face showed she was beginning to understand no more than the adults realized. As evening approached, Kwame finally picked up his office bag and slowly walked toward the library exit, preparing to perform the role of a successful father one more time. Cars moved through the crowded streets. Workers returned home to their families, and among them, Kwame quietly blended back into the evening crowd. And as the city slowly prepared for night, Kwame Mensah walked home, carrying nothing in his office bag except exhaustion, fear, and another day of carefully hidden truths. The closer Kwame came to home, the slower his footsteps became, because every step toward that small house was another step deeper into the lie he hated carrying. Inside the house, Amma suddenly lifted her head toward the door. "Papa's home!" Kojo jumped up immediately, his small feet racing excitedly across the floor toward the entrance. The moment Kwame saw the children rushing toward him, he forced the exhaustion off his face and replaced it with the smile of a father trying desperately not to break. Before Kwame could even step fully inside, Kojo wrapped his small arms tightly around him, and for one painful moment, Kwame almost forgot the weight he carried all day. Amma stayed a little further back, watching her father carefully the same way she had started doing more often lately. From the kitchen doorway, Abena looked at Kwame silently, not with anger, not with blame, but with the growing fear that something inside his smile no longer looked real. Kwame slowly removed the office bag from his shoulder, careful not to let anyone notice how empty it really was. "Papa, was work busy today?" Kojo asked innocently, looking up at him with complete trust. For the smallest moment, Kwame froze. Because sometimes, the hardest lies are the ones told to the people who love you most. "Yeah, very busy today," Kwame replied softly, forcing a tired smile onto his face while avoiding his son's eyes. Kojo nodded with admiration almost instantly, the way children do when they still believe their parents can survive anything. But Amma said nothing. She simply kept watching her father quietly, as though trying to understand something no child should ever need to question. A few minutes later, Abena quietly placed dinner onto the floor mat for the family. Simple food, small portions, carefully divided. I ate something at work earlier. Kwame lied gently, even though his stomach had been empty the entire day. Abena looked at him for a brief second and silently realized the truth immediately. But she said nothing. Because some marriages survive through words and others survive through silence. Without drawing attention to it, Abena slowly moved part of her own portion closer to Kwame, a quiet act of love from someone who was hungry too. Kwame lowered his eyes immediately because sometimes kindness hurts more than judgment ever could. As the night continued, the little house slowly became quieter, but beneath that silence, every person inside carried worries they no longer knew how to speak about. Later that night, after Kojo finally fell asleep, Amma quietly overheard her parents speaking in low voices from the next room. "We can delay the landlord one more week," Apena whispered carefully, trying not to wake the children. "But the school payment." Her voice slowly faded before finishing the sentence. Kwame didn't answer immediately, because deep down, he already knew there wasn't enough money left for either problem. From the dark hallway nearby, Amma quietly listened to every word, and little by little, the world around her no longer felt as safe as it once did. "The teacher sent another reminder today," Apena whispered carefully. "They said Amma may not be allowed back into class next week if we don't pay." For a moment, Kwame looked like a man carrying the weight of an entire world alone, and yet he still tried to hide it. "I'll handle it tomorrow," Kwame finally said quietly, even though he had absolutely no idea how. Abina nodded slowly, pretending his answer gave her comfort, but both of them understood the silence that followed. Without making a sound, Amma slowly stepped away from the hallway and returned to bed carrying worries far too heavy for a 10-year-old child. And little by little, the small house finally became silent again. But sleep did not come easily that night, not for Kwame, not for Apena, and not for Amma. Hours later, the small lantern near the wall finally flickered one last time, before darkness quietly swallowed the room completely. Even after everyone else became quiet, Kwame's mind refused to rest. Every unpaid bill, every lie, every promise he could not keep, moved endlessly through his head. Slowly, Kwame reached into his pocket and opened the same empty wallet he had checked countless times already, as if somehow the money inside might magically increase overnight. A few coins rested inside the wallet, barely enough for transportation, let alone school fees, rent, or food. Kwame slowly lifted his eyes toward his family sleeping nearby, and suddenly, the fear inside his chest became almost unbearable. But Amma wasn't truly asleep. Behind closed eyes, she quietly listened to her father's slow breathing in the darkness. And before Kwame had even truly rested, morning slowly began returning to the small house once again. Another day, another performance, another lie waiting to begin. With slow, exhausted movements, Kwame stood up quietly and began preparing for another fake day at the office. From across the room, Abena silently watched her husband getting ready, and deep inside, the feeling that something was terribly wrong only grew stronger. As the sun slowly rose over the neighborhood, Kwame Mensa prepared himself for another long day of pretending. not because he wanted to lie to his family, but because he still hadn't found the courage to tell them the truth. The neighborhood was still half asleep as Kwame quietly stepped outside once again, another morning pretending to leave for work. Before the city fully opened its eyes, from behind the curtain, Abena quietly watched her husband disappear down the street, and for the first time, a painful question formed clearly in her mind. Where does he really go every day? Kwame never turned around because deep down, he feared he might see the truth already growing in his wife's eyes. Inside the house, Amma quietly prepared for school while thinking about the conversation she heard during the night. Before leaving, Amma quietly pushed the damaged part of her shoe beneath her foot, hoping nobody at school would notice. Mama, when Papa gets paid again, can we finally buy bread with chocolate inside? Kojo asked innocently, completely unaware of the silence his question created. Apena smiled softly, the same painful smile tired parents learn to wear when they cannot give their children the answers they deserve. Meanwhile, Kwame returned to the same park bench once again. The same bench, the same empty hours, the same growing fear inside his chest. Nearby, real workers moved confidently through the city carrying lunches, tools, and purpose. And with every passing stranger, Kwame felt himself shrinking further inside. Slowly, Kwame pulled out his old phone once again, hoping for a missed call, a message, any small sign that life might finally change. But the screen stayed empty. No calls, no interviews, no opportunities, only silence. A small red warning suddenly appeared on Kwame's phone screen. Low battery. Even the phone he depended on for hope was slowly running out of energy too. After staring at the screen for several seconds, Kwame slowly powered the phone off himself, not to save battery, but because he could no longer handle waiting for calls that never came. Meanwhile, at school, Amma sat quietly through class, but her mind kept drifting back to the conversation she heard the night before. Amma? The teacher suddenly called. The classroom turned toward her, pulling her back from the heavy thoughts inside her mind. Yes, teacher. Amma answered softly, pretending nothing was wrong the same way her father did every single day. A few minutes later, the teacher began handing papers to students, one by one, fee reminders. The moment Amma saw the paper coming toward her desk, her stomach tightened immediately, because now, the problem inside her home had officially followed her to school, far away from the classroom. Kwame leaned back against the old bench and closed his eyes for a moment, not to rest, but simply to escape reality for a few seconds. Then suddenly, someone quietly sat down on the other side of the bench, a man around Kwame's age, wearing dusty construction clothes and carrying a metal lunch container. For a few quiet moments, neither man said anything. Then slowly, the construction worker opened his small metal lunch container beside him. The simple smell of warm food drifted softly through the air, and immediately, Kwame's empty stomach tightened painfully. Again, the worker quietly glanced toward Kwame for a brief second, the kind of glance shared between people who recognize struggle without needing words. You should eat something, brother, the worker said gently, holding out part of his lunch toward Kwame. No, I'm okay, Kwame replied automatically, the same lie he had been telling everyone lately, including himself. The man smiled faintly. Brother, hungry people always say they're okay. For several silent seconds, Kwame couldn't move. Then slowly, he accepted the food with trembling hands. Not because he wanted charity, but because his body could no longer pretend it wasn't starving. The moment Kwame took the first bite, he lowered his head immediately because somehow being fed by a stranger hurt his pride more than the hunger itself. Life humbles every man eventually, the worker said quietly while eating beside him. The important thing is surviving long enough to stand again. Kwame said nothing in return, but deep inside, those simple words stayed with him far longer than the meal itself. After finishing his meal, the construction worker slowly stood up from the bench. Before leaving, he gave Kwame one final look. "Don't give up, brother," the worker said softly before walking away, and somehow, those 4 words stayed heavier than everything else that day. For several moments, Kwame simply stared at the remaining food in his hands. A stranger had noticed his suffering before his own family did. Back at school, while other children rushed outside laughing, Emma stayed quietly at her desk, carefully folding the fee reminder paper inside her notebook. As Amma slowly packed her bag, her teacher quietly noticed the sadness on her face. "Amma, is everything all right at home?" the teacher asked softly, and immediately, Amma lowered her eyes. Amma stayed quiet for a few seconds after hearing the question. Her small fingers tightened around the old notebook resting in her lap. Then slowly, she forced a tiny smile. "Yes, teacher, everything is okay." But even as the words left her mouth, her eyes quietly betrayed the truth. The teacher looked at her carefully for a moment longer, as if deciding whether to ask more questions, but eventually, she only nodded softly and let Amma leave. And somehow, that kindness made Amma feel even heavier inside. Meanwhile, Kwame slowly left the park and began walking through the crowded streets again. People rushed past him carrying shopping bags, work papers, conversations about ordinary life. But Kwame barely noticed any of it. His mind remained trapped inside the same thoughts over and over again. School fees, rent, food, electricity, and worst of all, the growing fear that his family might soon discover the truth he could no longer control. As Kwame continued walking, he briefly slowed near a small restaurant window. Inside, families laughed together over warm meals. Workers ate freely without counting every coin in their pockets. Kwame stood there quietly for only a few seconds before lowering his eyes and continuing forward again, because some things hurt too much to look at for long. After school ended, Hama walked home slower than usual. The folded fee reminder remained hidden safely inside her notebook, but its weight somehow felt heavier with every step. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to understand that adults sometimes cried silently too. And as the afternoon slowly faded toward evening once again, both father and daughter carried different versions of the same fear. One was trying desperately to hide the truth, and the other was slowly beginning to see it. Back at home, Abena quietly emptied a small cloth purse onto the table. A few coins rolled across the wood. She counted them once, then counted them again, as if the number might somehow change. But it never did. The room stayed silent except for the soft sound of coins touching the table, and with every second, the pressure inside her chest grew heavier. Nearby, Kojo sat on the floor drawing pictures with a broken pencil. Every few minutes, he looked toward the door excitedly, still waiting for his father to come home from work. Too young to understand that the hardest lies are often told to protect the people we love. As evening approached, Kwame finally returned to the neighborhood, but before reaching the door, he stopped walking. The lights inside the house were already glowing softly through the window. His family was waiting for him, and suddenly, he no longer felt ready to walk inside. Inside the house, Ama was the first to notice him standing outside. For a moment, she simply watched her father through the window, and something about the way he stood there alone made her heart ache quietly. A few seconds later, Kwame forced a tired smile onto his face, adjusted his tie one more time, and finally opened the door. The performance was beginning again. That night, the family sat together for dinner like always, but something felt different. The conversation was smaller, the smiles were weaker, and the silence between words lasted longer than before. Even Kojo noticed it. Later that night, after Kojo fell asleep, Ama quietly overheard her parents speaking in low voices again. "The landlord came today," Abena whispered carefully. "He said we cannot delay any longer." For several seconds, Kwame said nothing, and that silence alone gave Abena her answer. Then finally, Kwame spoke the words he had spent months trying to hide. "I lost my job." The room became completely still. No anger, no shouting, only silence. The kind of silence that changes a family forever. Abina slowly lowered her eyes. Suddenly, everything made sense. The missing money, the tired face, the long, empty days. Kwame had not been abandoning the family. He had been drowning alone while trying to protect them from sinking with him. Without saying anything, Ama slowly walked toward her father. Then quietly, she placed the folded school fee paper into his hands. Kwame stared at it silently, and for the first time in months, he finally broke down, crying. That night, for the first time in a very long time, no one pretended anymore. No fake smiles, no fake work days, no fake answers. Only a tired family, finally facing the truth together. The next morning, life was still difficult. The bills had not disappeared, the rent was still unpaid, and Kwame still had no job. But something inside the house had changed. The burden was no longer carried by one person alone, and sometimes that is where healing truly begins. The next few days were still difficult. Kwame continued searching for work across the city every morning, but now he no longer pretended to live for an office that didn't exist. And somehow, that small truth made the weight inside him feel lighter at home. Abena quietly began cooking extra bread and tea to sell to nearby workers in the mornings. The money was small, but for the first time in months, the struggle inside the house no longer belonged to one person alone. Ama also changed quietly after that night. She stopped asking for things the family could not afford. She protected her younger brother from worrying too much, and sometimes she even helped her mother before school without being asked. Childhood had begun leaving her a little too early, and every evening, Kojo still ran excitedly toward the door whenever Kwame returned home. To him, his father was still the strongest man in the world. Maybe that innocent belief was exactly what Kwame needed to keep going. Then one afternoon, while walking through the city again, Kwame's phone suddenly rang. For one brief second, his heart completely stopped. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a huge opportunity. Just a small warehouse job interview on the other side of the city. But after months of silence, to Kwame, it sounded like hope. That evening, for the first time in a very long time, Kwame walked home a little faster, not because life was suddenly fixed, but because hope had quietly returned. Life did not magically become perfect after that day. The bills still existed, the struggles still remained. But now, the family faced those struggles together. And sometimes, hope does not arrive loudly. Sometimes, it simply walks quietly back through the front door.